Hi everybody, this is Wendy Lokanc-Diluzio. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss the sexual and reproductive health of street-involved youth. What I'm discussing is actually the findings from phase 1 of my doctoral dissertation, which was a sequential mixed method study. Phase 1 was qualitative, so that's what I'm going to be discussing today, was the qualitative findings. In this presentation, I'll discuss the research purpose and research question, the sample and sampling methods, the data collection methods, the data analysis, the findings, and how I try to enhance the quality and rigor of the study. So the purpose of the first phase of my dissertation research was to assess the sexual and reproductive health learning needs of service providers working with street-involved youth for the purpose of informing the development of sexual and reproductive health training programs. And the research question guiding this phase of the study was, what knowledge do street-involved youth require from service providers to protect and promote their sexual and reproductive health? The sample for this phase of the study consisted of 6 service providers and 9 street-involved youth. In terms of sampling, purposive and convenient sampling methods were used. Purposive sampling is when the researcher selects the best participants based on the quality of their insights and willingness to reflect on the phenomenon of interest. This sampling method was used for the recruitment of the service provider participants. This sampling method allowed for representation from different kinds of service providers from a variety of agencies and organizations. Convenient sampling is when participants are asked to participate based on their availability. Convenient sampling was used for the street-involved youth. I went to a street-involved youth serving agency and interviewed youth consenting to participate in the interviews. Prior to commencing the interviews, all interviewees completed a demographic form. All 6 service providers were female and ranged in age from 23 to 57 years, with a mean age of about 40 years. In terms of education, 3 participants had undergraduate degrees, 2 participants had some college or university education, and 1 participant had a master's degree. In terms of occupation, 2 people were public health nurses, 2 were social workers, 1 was a youth worker, and 1 was a program manager with a social work background. It would have been beneficial to interview an educator or a teacher working with street-involved youth in an alternative school setting. However, it would require additional ethics application to the Calgary Board of Education, and therefore, due to time constraints, I made a decision along with my supervisor to not interview a teacher. However, the 2 nurse participants that I interviewed had direct knowledge of the alternative school since they were school nurses working in both alternative and mainstream schools, although they were not actual employees within the Board of Education. In terms of the youth participants, 6 were male, 3 were female, 8 were between the ages of 18 and 24, and 1 was under the age of 18. The mean age was about 21 years of age. In terms of education, the sample included 1 person attending high school, 2 that had completed high school, 5 that had completed grades 8 to 11, and 1 that did not provide any educational information for me. In terms of culture, ethnicity, the sample included 4 that identified themselves as Caucasian, 3 as Aboriginal, 1 as Black Caucasian, and 1 as Aboriginal Caucasian. Although it would have been helpful to interview more youth under the age of 18, it wasn't feasible because of the challenges of obtaining parental consent. data were collected through semi-structured, in-depth interviews. The interviews lasted between 20 minutes and 110 minutes. The interviews took place in a private room to ensure privacy and anonymity. The interviews were voice recorded and then transcribed at a later time. And you can see on this slide that I've provided an example of the questions or the types of questions that I asked. For example, with the street-involved youth, I began by saying, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? What's your age? How long have you been involved in street culture or street life? I also asked, in your opinion, what are the most important sexual health concerns that street-involved youth face? And which sexual health topics do you think most street-involved youth need help with? And do you feel street youth have easy access to accurate sexual health information? Why or why not? And how can access be improved? And of course, because the interviews were semi-structured, it wasn't this prescriptive. I had the questions there, but I really wanted the participants to take the research interview where they wanted to go with it, and then I asked more detailed questions when they provided some shallow information, just to extract more information that was in more depth. In terms of the semi-structured interview questions for the service providers, once again I began by asking them to tell me a little bit about themselves and what their role was as a service provider at the agency they represented and how long they had worked with street-involved youth. I asked them to tell me about some of the main challenges that they faced, and I asked them to tell me about their perceptions of the sexual and reproductive health of street-involved youth and what they as service providers needed to be able to promote the sexual health of street youth. And I asked what information they would need if we as Alberta Health Services were to develop some kind of a training program for them. So, the information that I was able to obtain in phase 1 of this study, so that all of this qualitative stuff was then used to create a training program for phase 2 of the study, which was then implemented and evaluated using quasi-experimental mixed methods. So in terms of the data analysis, I used qualitative content analysis to guide the analysis portion of the research process. In terms of the findings from the study, there were 3 main themes that emerged from the data, as well as several sub-themes. A theme that emerged from service provider and youth interviews included the importance of providing culturally appropriate sexual and reproductive health services, and this means A, recognizing the strengths of street-involved youth, B, understanding the sexual and reproductive health challenges that street-involved youth face, C, understanding the complex life circumstances of street-involved youth, and D, understanding the facilitators of sexual and reproductive health protection and promotion. So sub-theme A, which is the importance of acknowledging the strengths of street-involved youth, what came out in terms of this sub-theme was, in order to provide culturally sensitive sexual and reproductive health services, providers should recognize the strengths of street-involved youth. It was evident in speaking to youth and service providers that these youth possess several strengths, including their ability to learn from experience, access services and resources, ask for help, and survive while facing adversity. There's a quote here by Jade, who was a street-involved youth. She said, "It's true, you learn a lot about yourself, your strengths and weaknesses when it comes to depending on yourself. I noticed that I learned a lot about myself when I was homeless because it puts you to the test. It's like, are you going to live? Or are you going to starve? Or are you going to ask for help? What are you going to do? You have choices, right? You learn a lot depending on what choice you make. It's an experience. So sub-theme B was complex life circumstances of street-involved youth. In order to provide culturally appropriate services, it's important to recognize that these youth have complex and diverse life circumstances, and that disease prevention and health promotion can prove challenging. Some youth have direct knowledge of abuse or neglect. Others come from poverty-stricken families. Some leave home at their parents' insistence. Others leave because they become involved in drugs and alcohol. One youth said, "I was living with my auntie to the age of 13 because my mom gave us away. Then I went and relived with my mom when I was 13, and she chose a child molester over her kids, so I ran away from home. And I've been on the street since. Nobody in my family believed me about what was going on, so I don't really talk to them." Sub-theme C, sexual and reproductive health challenges of street-involved youth. In order to provide culturally sensitive sexual and reproductive health services, it's imperative to have an understanding of the sexual and reproductive health challenges of street-involved youth. Youth and service providers identified 11. So, varied sexual and reproductive health knowledge base. Youth and service providers agreed that street-involved youth possessed varied levels of knowledge with regards to sexual health. Many of the youth interviewed appeared knowledgeable regarding some aspects of sexual health and confident in their knowledge base. However, many of those youth admitted that they gained their knowledge over time through experience and upon their own initiation. For example, Carlos revealed, it's pretty hard when you're a youth, right? Like, I was raised in foster care. I was never taught anything about sex. I was always just told what to do. I was always treated as a second-class person, like I was just living there. I wasn't a child. I was just living there. I was never taught anything about sex, and I had to learn on my own, which is really hard. There's a lot of confusion with that, you know. The older youth felt the younger ones needed more information regarding sexual health. They also reported that many youth think they know more than they actually do. From the service providers' perspectives, youth possessed some knowledge, however, they had misconceptions as well. One school nurse said, one school nurse pointed out that the youth she deals with lack general understanding of the body, knowledge typically gained in schools. Because the other thing, so what she said is, because the other thing I find with these kids and the street kids too, they're all the ones that have skipped out of school, right? They haven't been to half their classes or even a quarter. So what I find with these kids is their general knowledge about their body is lacking because they've missed so much information about general biology and how things work. Unprotected intercourse. Several youth and service providers identified unprotected intercourse as a particular challenge for some of these youth. Most youth understood the importance of using condoms to prevent STIs and HIV, even if they did not always use them. Their reasons included in being drunk from alcohol or being high on drugs, lack of planning before intercourse, refusal of their partner, and a lack of sensation. One of the participants said peer pressure into not using condoms, or they just think it's cool not to use them, or some girls think it's cool to get pregnant young and have a kid. And sometimes guys don't use them because they think it feels weird or something like that. It doesn't have the same feeling, or I guess they could think that if they don't want to use them because everybody else is doing it and not using them, She went on to say, when you're drunk and you mix alcohol and drugs together, your mind isn't thinking the same. A lot of people do that. Sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections. Every youth and service provider reported that STIs presented challenges to street-involved youth. In her interview, Jade shared her story. And you can see from this quote, she says, I had had chlamydia for so long that my body was, I guess, trying to fight it. And I was, oh my gosh, what's wrong? And it hurt so bad. It was shorting my breath. I thought I had something else. I never would have thought that it would actually be related to an STI in the end. I was getting stomach pains on the sides, my whole body. It felt like my organs were basically like doing random things. So I went in and they did a test or whatever, and they're like, yeah, you're positive for chlamydia, and you've had it for quite some time. So the symptoms that Jade is actually describing is PID, or pelvic inflammatory disease, where she's had chlamydia for so long that it actually traveled up her reproductive organs and caused severe infection. Pregnancy and repeated pregnancy. Youth and service providers agreed that street-involved youth had problems avoiding pregnancy and repeated pregnancy. One of the youth that I had interviewed, Caitlin, she actually had 3 pregnancies. So in her quote, she says, I have 2 kids. One lives with grandparents and the other one the dad ran away with. There was no custody. He just up and disappeared. I feel a little stressed out about this pregnancy because of the situation of being on the street. But I was on the streets when I had my other ones. I'm hoping I won't be on the streets when this one comes out. Youth and service providers described that the issue of pregnancy is complicated. Although street-involved youth took contraceptives, some became pregnant, whereas others get pregnant because they actually intend to get pregnant. For example, one youth named Kevin said that he thought some females deliberately become pregnant. He said, well, with my personal experience, some girls like to get together because they're planning on getting pregnant. And I feel like more girls want to have babies. So a service provider named Rachel, she said this: women, young women having babies, getting them apprehended by child welfare, getting pregnant again on purpose. But they want a baby because they think that the baby will give them infinite love, right? Not the other way around. So these are people who their babies will keep being apprehended, and this is like 7 babies in a row. And to see that is so soul destroying. Acceptance in relation to sexual diversity presented challenges for some youth. Some youth identifying as LGBTQ+ end up on the streets because they face rejection at home. Although youth find more acceptance on the street compared to at home, some still report a lack of acceptance. So Caitlin talked about her friend John. She said, my best friend John, he's gay, and he's having problems because a lot of people are like, yeah, we understand. We accept him for who he is. But a lot of other people are not as accepting. They're like teasing him or they're degrading him. Like me and John talked, and he said that he knew he was gay since he was little. His parents don't like it, but he's there. As his friends and his family, we accept him for who he is. When people tease him, we get mad at them. He's a normal person, just like the rest of us. Stop teasing him. Emotions related to sexual and reproductive health. In terms of getting help, youth describe feelings that can prevent them from seeking information or services. For example, one youth, Tony, explained, he spoke about comfort. He said, like having comfort, feeling comfortable talking about it, I guess is a very important issue. Because a lot of people are shy and try to laugh it away, or try to tell jokes, Like when the ladies come to talk about sexual health, a lot of people keep goofing around. Whereas another youth, Carlos, spoke about embarrassment. My buddies, they're not really too personal around here. Everybody's really protective, and really distant. We don't really like to talk about stuff like that too much. Even when the sex lady was here, I could talk to a person one-on-one about it, but I can't talk about it in front of my friends. I won't. It's just too embarrassing for me. And then Kevin actually spoke about fear. He said, but there is the fear aspect. Some people don't want to know. I know, like, when I go in and I'm not sure and I'm waiting, and even right before I get my results, it's like ideas run through my mind, and we got to get a hold of everybody you slept with and stuff. I don't even know their names or some of them or whatever. Fear is a big thing for sure. No one wants to have bad news brought upon them if they got something that's going to affect them for the rest of their lives. Relationships. Some youth reported that maintaining relationships is a challenge for them when living on the streets. For example, speaking about issues such as condom use and STI testing with a partner can be difficult. Some spoke about feeling pressure to have sex or not use condoms. Both service providers and youth discussed power imbalances within the relationships. There's a quote there that you can read by Sienna, which was very graphic and really moved me. And there's another quote that I have posted there by Anne. And what she said was, and she's a public health nurse, a school nurse, she said, some of the discussions I've had with gals absolutely curl my hair. Like they are in relationships with men who control them. Yet they have been part of families where power, control, violence has been an issue. And I guess I naively thought, I just always thought that if you came from a family where there was a lot of violence, why would you ever hang out with a guy that hits you? So I saw a girl in clinic the day that she came out of court with the abusive father of her child. So she was angry that the judge allowed this young man visiting privileges with their 2-year-old. By the end of it, she was crying and telling me how much she loved him, the father of her child. You've got a restraining order. You've been to court 5 times. He's put you in a shelter. I don't know how many times with a blackened eye and beat you up. So again, very moving quote. Some service providers spoke about the difficulty youth have in recognizing that a relationship is unhealthy because the fact that they've only been surrounded by unhealthy relationships. So to them, an unhealthy relationship is actually normal. Substance use and sex. Nearly every participant agreed that substance abuse was problematic when it came to safer sex. Using substances not only made youth more likely to have sex, but it made youth more likely to have unprotected sex. And you can see a quote on the slide by Tony. Sexual exploitation. According to youth and service providers, some street-involved youth fall victim to sexual exploitation. One service provider described the revolving door in which some youth get caught. She said, we have a lot of prostitution. They need the money. They may still be going to school in the daytime, or they drop out of school for a while and we hear that they're on the street someplace, and then they'll come back again, and then they'll get pregnant. Others may become involved in sex trade to pay for their addiction. And you can see the quote by Jade there. She talks about getting involved in the sex trade to pay for drugs. She said, I see the sex trade more with homeless people that are involved with drug life. A lot of that because when you get addicted to drugs, you kind of lose sense of yourself. Definitely a very big part of yourself gets lost, especially with crack cocaine. So she goes on to talk a little bit about her own experience. Access to sexual and reproductive health services. Nearly every participant described sexual and reproductive health services as accessible to street-involved youth. The problem for many came down to knowing where or how to access the services and then taking the initiative. One youth said the following: "There's a lot of help for homeless people. If you don't know where to find what you're looking for, then it's pretty much your own fault because you didn't look very hard. There's a lot of help, like you can get condoms anywhere. Like you guys come around and tell everybody they can go for STD tests and pregnancy tests and such and such." Now, something I found that was for younger youth or those newer to Calgary, there was more uncertainty regarding what services were available for street-involved youth, but definitely the ones that had been involved on the streets for a while knew what was available. Facilitators of sexual and reproductive health protection and promotion. Youth and service providers spoke about the importance of approaching the topic of sexual and reproductive health with youth in a sensitive manner. Youth want and deserve information presented in an open, professional, and factual manner. Youth also want respectful and non-judgmental treatment. Youth also spoke about the importance of talking about sexual and reproductive health in order to demystify it and normalize it. They would welcome supportive conversations that respect confidentiality and create trust. Additionally, the service providers spoke about the importance of avoiding assumptions regarding the sexual and reproductive health of these youth. Rachel said, "It's our assumptions that get us into trouble, and it's mostly a matter of social class. Most of the workers are middle class. Most of the people we work with are not." A second theme that emerged from the interviews was the importance of relationships. This means connecting with youth and connecting youth to dependable services. In terms of connecting with youth, youth and service providers spoke about the importance of relationships in promoting and protecting the sexual health of street-involved youth. It's important to establish a relationship with youth so that they feel comfortable asking questions. Service providers also spoke about the importance of understanding the history of the clients you work with. So one of the quotes that addressed me was one from Rachel, a service provider. She says, "It's like when they say boyfriend, they might mean that old man who's letting them stay there, but they're calling him their boyfriend to normalize it so they don't feel like a prostitute every day, right? And so when they say boyfriend, this is why you need a relationship so that you have some history with them." Rachel went on to say that without knowing a client or their life circumstances, a service provider can unknowingly place a client in danger. Rachel shared a situation where she encouraged a client to negotiate the use of condoms with a partner, not knowing the youth was in an abusive relationship. So sub-theme B is connecting youth to dependable services. Another important aspect of relationships is the ability to connect youth with the sexual and reproductive health services that they require, but also the services they know won't let them down or treat them in a bad way. The final theme that emerged from the interviews focused on the resources and support required by service providers. This means providing the opportunity for capacity building or development and providing accessible resources and tools. Capacity development opportunities. All service providers acknowledged that they required more knowledge of sexual and reproductive health in order to work with street-involved youth. For some, these gaps in knowledge could be uncomfortable and required consultations with the people that they perceived were the experts. Accessible tools and resources. Service providers reported that they needed a toolbox with appropriate information and teaching aids that are accurate, up-to-date, user-friendly, and population appropriate. Additionally, they wanted immediate answers from a reputable source. So one service provider said, "I think they need to have easily accessible tools, and I think that having online links or a place or something that's user-friendly to the healthcare provider, but that has those links. You could sit down with a kid with how to use a condom, and we could sit through the little video clip, and then you could say, okay, so let's go get one out. Because of this research, I then went on to write a funding proposal to develop the website that you've seen in other parts of this course, called task.ca, or Talking About Sexuality in Canadian Communities. It was developed in 2011 and then redesigned in 2016 to include information for service providers working with youth with intellectual disabilities. And for me, it was important to conduct a piece of research that could go on and be used for something, not just sit on a shelf. Quality and rigor are terms that refer to determining if the qualitative findings are accurate from the perspective of the participant, the researcher, or the readers. Qualitative researchers assume that reality has multiple interpretations and understanding depends on subjective interpretation. Nevertheless, in qualitative research, it's important for researchers to consider how to promote quality and rigor in an investigation. Some of the strategies I used included bias clarification. Bias clarification is important throughout the entire research process. Understanding one's psychological baggage helps to identify any personal biases that can influence data collection, analysis, and reporting of the findings. As I entered into the research process, I reflected upon my experiences and preconceived expectations of the findings. Acknowledging these sources of bias and reflecting upon them assisted me in remaining open to the data, and in the end, some of the findings were expected, but many were not. Reflexivity is related to the notion of bias clarification, and it refers to the active acknowledgement by the researcher that their own actions and decisions will inevitably impact upon the meaning and context of the experience under investigation. So I acknowledged that I'm central to the phenomenon under investigation and that I can't separate myself from all aspects of the research process. My experiences, my personal values, as well as the values of the organization I work for have impacted all aspects of this study, including the conceptualization of the research questions, the type of information collected, and the interpretation of the findings. I also acknowledged that my race, level of education, and socioeconomic status likely had an impact on the interactions I had with the street-involved youth participants. Although these experiences can influence the findings, or can produce findings that may be biased, I believe these experiences also could have a positive impact, as that it assisted me in producing meaningful findings or extracting meaningful findings. In order to enhance the quality and rigor of the findings, techniques that provide an external verification of the research process were also employed. Peer debriefing and member checking provided external validation of the research. Peer debriefing entails a meeting with at least one objective peer to evaluate and explore aspects of the investigation. I debriefed with 2 of my peers regarding the results. Member checking, on the other hand, also referred to as respondent validation, refers to sharing the report, the thematic analysis, or specific descriptions with the participants in order to increase accuracy of the results. And I reported back to 2 of the sampled service providers. I would have liked to have reported back to the street-involved youth, but I could no longer find them by the time I had analyzed the data. Another way to enhance the validity and rigor of your findings is through writing in a very clear and detailed manner, and that was my greatest goal. When I've written my dissertation, as well as a publication that I have in a textbook. Another way to enhance quality and rigor was after the transcripts were transcribed, I read I listened to the audio tapes, and then I compared them to the transcripts to ensure that they were transcribed accurately. So I want to thank you for listening to this presentation on the sexual and reproductive health of street-involved youth. We discussed the purpose of the research, as well as the research question, the sample and sampling methods, data analysis, the findings, as well as how quality and rigor of the study was enhanced. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Thank you.